Sunset Overdrive is a game that I want to talk about today because I did my Max Payne video a couple weeks ago and it reminded me of all of the underrated games that I used to play back in the day and that I stand by now are so underappreciated and arguably forgotten about. And I think Sunset Overdrive is one of those to a T. It was a game that really broke the mold from a design perspective, but also thematically. I remember when that first trailer came out in either 2013, 2014, and it just immediately got me hooked because visually, from a, in game and in the cutscenes, it was such a breath of fresh air. It was such a sort of slap in the face to this gritty, serious tone we'd be seeing in first-person shooters and most AAA games over the last sort of 10 years. And it flipped that idea on its head and said, we're going to do something different. And it owned that idea completely. It embraced being weird with its striking visual style. And that's part of the reason what drew me to it in the first place, and so many others. And I remember Microsoft had a big marketing push for it, because I think the original plan for Sunset Overdrive was for it to be this system seller for the Xbox One, because you have to understand at the time, for those of you who don't remember, this was about a year on from the launch of the Xbox One, and the initial launch a year prior was disastrous, to say the least. Microsoft had put a big focus on the Xbox being a multimedia machine rather than just being a place to play games, which is what it always should have been. And I think Sunset Overdrive was one of their sort of efforts to return to form, right? Focus more on gaming, as they should have done. And they were going for something bold and risky, and it innately is always going to be that when you're building a new IP. But I think they knocked it out of the park in terms of their marketing, and there was a relentless amount of trailers, from live action to gameplay to, of course, the initial reveal ones too. And at the helm of it all was Insomniac, who, of course, if you don't know, went on to develop the Spider-Man PlayStation games. Have gone on to do incredible things, and of course Ratchet and Clank. And with both of those titles, you can absolutely see Sunset Overdrive sort of planted perfectly in between from a gameplay perspective. On the sort of movement mechanics you see in Spider-Man are so inspired by Sunset Overdrive, with the grinding, the wall running. It's one of the best, strongest parts of the game was that, and you could definitely tell that they took some of the elements from Sunset Overdrive and sort of shifted them faithfully over to the Spider-Man games. And looking back, of course, as I said, Ratchet and Clank, in terms of the wackiness, the unorthodoxy, and the use of the weapon wheel, all these different tools you have at your disposal, is so Ratchet and Clank, which maybe I'll do a video on that on this channel one of these days as well, because that series holds a special place in my heart too. And narrative-wise, that's usually a point I make as being a real strong suit for most games. Is what I'm probably drawn to the most when it comes to games. Of course, good gameplay is paramount, and I think it's probably the most important part of any game. But a good story is something that usually keeps me remembering a game years on. Sunset Overdrive is a game that never had that. Its story is serviceable at best and laughable at its lowest points. But Insomniac and the game as a whole, they own that. They knew that going in. It was never the main focus, and they never pretended it was, like many AAA devs do. You see so many games now in the modern age who make a big point about their narrative being a selling point and being a strong suit, despite the fact it's half the time, plays second fiddle to the other components. With Sunset Overdrive, it never pretended to be something it wasn't. It was mainly focused on fun gameplay, wackiness, and making the player have a damn good time. And I always appreciated that, even when I was a kid. I was 12 years old at the time when it came out. I really sort of understood that, I think. That there was just such a main focus on the gameplay. And that's what made me have so much fun with it, because the narrative was, forgettable. It was there, but the game is just so damn fun to play. And that's what surprises me the most, because, as I said, gameplay first is probably the most important factor for any title, having success on top of a big marketing push. And I think Sunset Overdrive really ticked both of those boxes, which is why it's so surprising that the game sort of didn't match sales expectations or hopes. Because critically, I remember the reception was great. There was a lot of 9s, some 10s out even there. out there even. So, you know, it's such a damn shame that it didn't hit the mark financially. And I guess that's just representative of the games industry as a whole. It kind of sucks because we are robbed of so many brilliant sequels and future projects because they don't hit the goals expected to. Good example of that is Thronebreaker, CD Projekt Red's standalone narrative-focused Gwent hybrid game, which I loved, and I probably will do a video on that. And I'll say it first, if you haven't played that game, please, please, please go and check it out, especially if you love Witcher 3, which I have done a video on as well. But, you know, that followed a similar fate to Sunset Overdrive in the fact that it didn't meet sales expectations, and we never saw another one, which is a shame because it's a brilliant game, as is Sunset Overdrive. And, you know, the most heartbreaking thing about that game is I remember there was a little Easter egg in it where they literally tease a sequel. There is in the world of the game while you're playing, they mention the sequel. It's a game that very much focuses on breaking the fourth wall a lot of the time. And they do that in teasing a sequel. And I'm sure perhaps in another timeline, another parallel universe, we would have got one. But unfortunately not. And of course, Insomniac, as I said, went on to do the things they went and did. Ended up getting, I believe, owned by Sony now. And of course, are working on their exclusives and various Spider-Man projects, etc., etc. And the Sunset Overdrive IP is just sitting there. And there was an eventual port to PC, which I was grateful for. But, you know, I'm still longing for that sequel, as are, I'm sure, many, many other people. But if you haven't played it, I really urge you to, because it's a game that just completely broke the mold. And I feel like I'm just going to have to reiterate on the gameplay as well. There's very few games where the core loop is so entertaining that it keeps you coming back. Because sure, as I mentioned earlier, the narrative is probably the weaker point. And there are weaker points to a game. It's not perfect. No game ever is. But the gameplay kept me coming back. And that's the mark of a really, really polished mechanical loop. Destiny is the perfect example of that. It's the reason I've played thousands of hours of it, even though so many elements of that game are lacking. So many. But the core gameplay is unrivaled. And it keeps me coming back. And the same can exactly be said about Sunset Overdrive. So I really, really hope, for those of you that have played it, you are just like me, clamoring for a game that will never get a sequel. But if you haven't checked it out, please, please go and do. And yeah, this is just a bit of a passion rant. I didn't really know which game I want to talk about today. But I think when I was making those other videos, particularly more recently, talking about Far Cry and stuff, I realized I was just going so negative with it. And I understand negativity thrives on YouTube and, you know, the social media space. It always has. But I just need to remind myself I really want to talk about the games that I love and the memories I've had with them. And that's what this channel was always about when I started it. So I'm going to try and continue to do that. And Sunset Overdrive is probably the perfect example of that. It still remains on my top games list, you know, and yeah, I'm smiling thinking about it now because it was, I have some good memories of that, pre-ordering it and getting very excited when it arrived. I don't even know where I'm going with this. I hope you guys are doing well. Yeah, have a good one, and I'll see you pretty soon.